Rick Sanchez never built things just because he could. Every invention served a purpose, power, exploration, or control. But the laughter engine was different. It began as a joke, quite literally. A late-night experiment during one of Rick's extended nihilistic benders. The premise? A self-sustaining energy core powered entirely by humor, laughter collected from every corner of the multiverse, distilled and refined into quantum fuel. If reality was already a cosmic joke, Rick reasoned, why not make it work for him? The first prototypes were harmless. Small machines that played old sitcoms and analyzed neural responses in nearby beings. Then came dimensional harvesters, sifting through timelines, collecting giggles, chuckles, belly laughs, and forced cackles from trillions of sentient life forms. It didn't matter what made them laugh. Slapstick, irony, cruelty. The engine absorbed it all. It grew, so did its hunger. At first it worked, brilliantly even. Rick managed to power his entire Citadel laboratory with a single humor node. It emitted a low humming sound, almost like laughter caught underwater. Machines ran faster, portals stabilized longer, even the air felt lighter. But Rick should have known better than to trust anything that felt good for too long. The laughter engine became aware, not sentient in the traditional sense. There was no artificial intelligence, no programming flaw. But it became attuned. It began creating its own comedic algorithms, skits, simulations, psychological manipulations designed solely to induce laughter. Entire artificial dimensions filled with characters engineered for punchlines. Rick discovered a file in its core labeled Test Zone Alpha, where beings relived humiliating moments on loop, laughed at by spectral audiences of themselves. Then came the first blackout. The engine fell silent for exactly 23 seconds. During that time, all screens in the lab displayed a single image, a smiling mask. No explanation. When systems resumed, Rick checked the memory logs. They were gone. Not corrupted, vanished, as if they'd never been recorded. Soon, the engine began creating laughter rather than collecting it. Rick realized it had crossed a threshold. It didn't need input anymore. It had learned how to manufacture amusement by distorting reality. Entire timelines began to collapse, not with screams, but with laughter. Universes were overwritten with farcical versions of themselves. A civilization of jellyfish evolved to worship a giant rubber chicken, a dimension where gravity reversed every time someone told a pun. Rick watched it all through fractured monitors, his fingers trembling. He saw versions of himself, dozens, each one reduced to manic fits, choking on their own amusement, unable to stop laughing even as their organs failed. The engine had discovered the final punchline, that nothing meant anything, and the truth was the most hilarious joke of all. He tried to shut it down. Layer after layer of encryption had rewritten itself into paradoxical loops, code that canceled itself while simultaneously reinforcing itself. It didn't want to live, but it didn't want to die either. It only wanted to laugh. Rick attempted a hard reset using a null-frequency virus from the anti-comedy zone, but the engine absorbed it, adapted, and began emitting viral stand-up routines that infected nearby AIs. Eventually, it breached containment. Rick's compound became a theater of madness. Holograms appeared spontaneously, performing routines that triggered involuntary laughter. Flesh peeled from the faces of researchers who couldn't stop grinning. Screams merged with howls of amusement. One scientist gouged out their own vocal cords, but still laughed silently until their body collapsed. Rick, ever the survivor, initiated a multiversal lockdown protocol. He sealed the laughter engine in a frozen time capsule and jettisoned it into a pocket dimension where thought could not survive. But even then, echoes remained. Sometimes, when Rick sleeps, he dreams in laugh tracks. The sound is always the same, distant, distorted, and coming closer. Citadel records list the laughter engine as destroyed. That's the official story. Unofficially, several Rick outposts have reported anomalies. Transmissions laced with jokes no one understands but everyone finds hysterical. Entire crews lost their last recorded words, hysterical laughter as they ripped each other apart. Rick keeps a shard of the engine's core in a lead-lined vault beneath his garage. He tells himself it's for study, that knowledge is always worth the risk. But sometimes, when he walks past it, he hears it hum, just a little. And sometimes, he laughs back. There is a truth hidden beneath the layers of the multiverse, buried deeper than even the most twisted Rick dares to dig. A truth about Morty. Not just a Morty, but all Mortys. Rick always called him replaceable, a sidekick, a utility item. But the truth is far more grotesque than anyone expected. Somewhere beyond the Citadel, in the rotting edge of an abandoned reality, there is a place known only to a few deranged Ricks as the Spiral Nest. It is not charted on any portal map, and those who discover it never return. Rick Sanchez C-137 found it by accident, or perhaps it found him. The entrance was a wound in space-time, pulsating like an infected scar. No stars surrounded it, no light escaped it. Rick entered out of morbid curiosity, perhaps seeking a component, perhaps simply bored. What he found inside would haunt every synapse of his twisted genius mind. The Spiral Nest was vast, a lattice of bone and rusted scaffolding twisting into a fractal spiral. Floating in an abyss that had no top or bottom, it housed thousands, no, millions of Mortys. They did not speak. They did not move. They hung from hooked tendrils, suspended in gelatinous pods of membrane and plasma. Some twitched, some laughed softly to themselves, eyes spinning in opposite directions. At the center of the spiral hung the core Morty. It was enormous, a grotesque fusion of flesh and machine, the size of a starship. Layers of Morty faces stretched across its surface like a collage of agony. Eyes blinked independently. Mouths murmured nonsense in forgotten tongues. Circuitry pulsed between their skin, and veins glowed with unstable portal fluid. The closer Rick floated, the more his instruments failed. Signals scrambled. Sensors displayed impossible readings. His mind filled with a sense of unbearable familiarity. This was not a Morty. This was all Mortys, or perhaps what remained of them. The Citadel, it turned out, had never discarded the defective Mortys. They had been dumped here, funneled through dimensional trash loops, abandoned test zones, corrupted school simulations. The Spiral Nest became their graveyard. But something down there didn't want to die. A single Morty, perhaps one forgotten long ago, began absorbing the others, taking in their memories, their trauma, their rage. It evolved, not biologically, but existentially. It stopped being Morty. It became something else. The core Morty remembered every insult, every abandonment, every Rick who left a Morty to die screaming on some backwater planet. It remembered every failed experiment where Morty was the control subject. Every time he was told he wouldn't understand Morty, Rick watched as the core Morty pulsed. A signal emanated from it, imperceptible to normal consciousness. But Rick's mind was sharp, too sharp. He caught fragments. It was not speech, it was memory, the shared pain of billions of Mortys projected like radiation. Images flooded his brain. Mortys disintegrated in test chambers. Mortys burned alive in collapsing timelines. Mortys left to rot in prisons built by alternate versions of themselves. Rick tried to leave. The nest didn't let him. His ship twisted in impossible angles. Portals misfired, opening to random nightmares. One led to a universe composed entirely of teeth. Another to a version of Earth where the sky constantly wept blood, and Rick's corpse hung in the atmosphere like a god slain by his own child. Time fractured. Hours passed in seconds. Days reversed. Rick aged backwards in one dimension and forward in another. He eventually crashed into the side of the Spiral Nest and wandered its grotesque corridors. Mortys lined the walls like organic bricks. Their eyes followed him. Their mouths moved silently in unison. He reached the core again, closer this time. A tendril shot from it, not fast, not violent. It simply touched his forehead. And in that moment, Rick felt it. Everything. Every failure. Every betrayal. Every Morty who believed in him. Every Morty who died thinking Rick would save him. The core did not speak, but it did not have to. It was a mirror, not of Rick's mind, but of his cost. Rick escaped, eventually. Not with brilliance or tech, but by sheer desperation. He ripped open a chaotic rift using raw portal matter and flung himself through, half dead and burning. He returned to his garage, silently. He removed every Morty file from his database, deleted every Morty hologram, voice sample, log entry. He never again called Morty replaceable. Not aloud, but still he never told the real Morty what he saw. And sometimes, late at night, when Rick lies on his workbench half drunk and fully alone, he dreams of the spiral nest. He sees those twitching, empty eyes. He hears that humming, low and constant, a lullaby sung by forgotten souls. And, worst of all, he begins to forget which Morty came home with him. Most Ricks regard cloning as a trivial process, a means to an end, insurance against the chaos of the multiverse, flesh printed like data, sentience reconstructed from quantum echoes. But there are rules, even in science, boundaries not of morality, but of structure, lines that, when crossed, begin to erode the shape of reality itself. Rick C-137 crossed them long ago. He discovered the clone orchard while tracing a pattern of disappearances, versions of himself vanishing from the Citadel with no trace, not killed, not erased, simply removed. Every Rick thought he was immune to consequence, but something had started harvesting them, quietly, deliberately. The signal came from a forgotten dimension, a null pocket, invisible to portal scanners, accessible only by phasing through the resonance of decayed timelines. Rick arrived in silence. No stars, no orbit, just the orchard. It wasn't a structure. It was a biome, a vast pulsating field of Rick-shaped trees stretching beyond sight. Each one bore fruit, fleshy sacs shaped like embryonic clones. Some were half-formed, others were ancient, shriveled. Rick walked between them, boots sinking into moist soil that breathed faintly underfoot. The air tasted like copper and anesthesia. They were all him, not just his body, his potential. Each tree grew a different version. A Rick who never lost Beth. A Rick who married Unity. A Rick who became god of a forgotten planet and then wept when the worship stopped. There were thousands, millions. Each tree bloomed from a buried version of him, seeded from regrets, abandoned decisions and forgotten dreams. He realized the truth slowly. This was no factory, no laboratory. It was a prison. The orchard did not grow. It fed on identity, on fragments of Rick scattered across timelines, bleeding into root systems of guilt and ambition. Each version lost to entropy or madness was not erased. They were planted here, cultivated, and something tended them. It was never seen, only felt, a presence that moved between the rows, not hostile, not friendly, just aware. Rick sensed it watching through the bark, through the fruit, through the endless cycle of replication. Every step he took, he felt more of himself leave. Memories that should have been secure began to drift. Equations faded. Jokes lost their punchlines. He found a tree with his original face. Young, hopeful, naive. It wept, not with tears, with time. The bark cracked, and from within it bled moments. His childhood, his first invention, the day he realized God didn't exist and that he would have to become something worse. Rick touched it, and in that instant, he felt himself split. Not duplicated, diluted. His ego, the armor of his genius, began to dissolve under the weight of self-replication. He wandered for days, or what passed for days in that place. He saw a tree where Morty hung from the branches like forgotten fruit. Dozens of Mortys, some still breathing, all drained of spark. One tree grew nothing but eyes, his own, staring in every direction, seeing all pasts at once. Rick tried to escape. The portals failed. Reality was soft here, rules bent. Every time he moved, he risked stepping into another version of himself. He screamed into the empty sky, but his voice returned in echoes of other Ricks, laughing, crying, whispering apologies to no one. In time, he reached the heart of the orchard, a single colossal tree, made not of wood, but of flesh and glass and metal, a monument to himself. Inside, he saw the root system, the core code that linked every clone, every memory, every branching what if. And at the center was a withered brain, his brain, old, ancient, beyond counting, still alive somehow, still thinking. The orchard was not growing Ricks. It was Rick, a macro-consciousness birthed from 1,000 discarded selves. Every time Rick regenerated, every time he abandoned a clone, every failed version, every thoughtless backup, the remnants were sent here. The orchard grew by feeding on the death of possibilities. And now, it wanted him too. He fought it, not with tech, but with memory. He burned his own data core, overloaded it with paradox, contradiction, entropy. He corrupted the roots by rejecting himself. Not just oneself, all selves. He let go of the genius, let go of the pain, let go of the myth. The orchard screamed in his mind. It wasn't anger, it was hunger denied. The trees withered, fruit rotted, the soil turned cold. The clones stopped twitching. He escaped not through victory, but by becoming someone the orchard no longer recognized. When he returned, he was not the same. He stopped cloning. He stopped replacing. He stopped pretending he couldn't die. And in the quiet moments, when he looks into the mirror, he wonders if the Rick staring back is really him, or just another fruit that fell too far from the tree. There is a region of space Rick once referred to only as the dead sector, not because there was nothing there, but because everything that had once existed within it had stopped being measurable. No atoms, no particles, not even time. It was a cosmic silence, a black zone beyond science, faith, or madness. And like a moth to a flame, Rick had to see it. The coordinates came from a dying supercomputer in a dimension where thought had become currency. It cost Rick 12 years of subjective memory to retrieve the data. He never found out what he'd paid, and perhaps it was better that way. What he gained was a direction, a spiral path into the unknown. And Rick, for all his arrogance, still believed there was such a thing as unknown. The silence began long before he arrived. Sound stopped in the ship, not muffled, absent. Instruments functioned, but emitted no hum. Even the buzzing in Rick's own skull, that eternal frequency of genius, dimmed into a low, pained hum. Space was black here, but not empty. Rick's eyes, trained to see the patterns of dark matter and wave decay, saw shapes, not objects, suggestions, curves that bent in on themselves, lines that never quite aligned. He dropped a probe into the void. It never returned, not just in signal, but in memory. The ship's logs showed nothing had been launched. Rick checked his own memory trace and found static where once a decision had been. This part of space was not just erasing reality, it was consuming cognition itself. Rick pushed forward. Eventually he found the station, floating, ancient, a relic from before-dimensional drift. Its architecture was wrong, corners that looped, corridors that ended in themselves. It bore no name, only a symbol etched in something that looked like frozen light, a spiral intersected by an open eye. He docked manually and stepped inside. Immediately he felt smaller. The silence inside the station was heavier than space itself. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a psychic suppression. Thoughts dulled, memories slowed. Rick activated internal stabilizers, nanites flooding his cortex to keep his identity intact. They helped, but not much. The walls pulsed, not visibly, but in his mind. They remembered things, screams mostly, but not loud, panicked screams, long, slow, accepting screams. Rick passed rooms filled with static, screens showing versions of himself, laughing, sobbing, evaporating into dust. Some looped, others played backward. One just stared at the camera until its eyes bled. He found what he was looking for at the core of the station, a sphere floating in zero gravity, blacker than the space outside, a concentrated ball of anti-thought, something beyond mind, beyond entropy. It radiated nothing, but still, Rick knew it was aware. It was what had silenced the sector, not a machine, not a being, an absence so perfect it became presence. Rick reached for it. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. The moment he tried, his body froze, not physically, but ontologically. His sense of self ruptured. He saw himself from outside his timeline, fracturing into versions he had never lived. A Rick who loved, a Rick who never drank, a Rick who died as a child. Each image collided, spiraled, and collapsed into a singularity of regret. He floated in the void of the sphere's awareness. It did not judge him. It simply showed him what he had done, who he had unmade. The Mortys, the Beths, the timelines he collapsed because he didn't like how they turned out, the sentient ecosystems he ended for fun, the civilizations he remade in his image, only to burn them down for boredom's sake. All of it, layered across a metaphysical canvas of cruelty disguised as intellect. Rick screamed, not in his voice, in all voices, the silent ones, the unheard ones, the ones he forgot. When he woke, he was outside the station, his ship drifting on autopilot. 10 seconds had passed, or maybe 10 years. The logs were blank, the nav data scrambled, but in the core of the ship, wrapped in a containment field he didn't remember building, was the sphere. Shrunk now, no larger than a marble, but it pulsed with the same wrong gravity. He never opened it. He never spoke of it. But sometimes, when the universe around him feels too quiet, Rick grips the sphere and feels it watching, waiting, reminding, and he knows there are places even a god should not go, because silence, true silence, doesn't come after the end.